The night was thick with the scent of rain, though not a single drop had fallen. It clung to the air, heavy and damp, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Eleanor checked her phone again. No signal. Just minutes ago, she had received the call, an invitation for an exclusive meeting at the luxurious Blackwood Hotel. The offer had been too good to refuse, but now, standing in front of the towering building, something felt wrong. The hotel loomed in the darkness, its neon sign flickering, the letters BLACKWOD struggling to stay lit. A strange sensation crept up her spine, a whisper of unease that she pushed aside. She stepped inside. The lobby was too quiet. Not the comforting silence of a peaceful night, but the kind that carried unseen eyes, listening, waiting. The receptionist was nowhere to be seen. The grand chandelier above barely flickered, casting long shadows against the marble walls. A single key rested on the counter. Room 609. Her name was written on a small card beside it. Eleanor hesitated. Who had left it there? The elevator ride felt endless. The numbers crawled upward, the dim yellow light above casting an eerie glow on her reflection in the mirrored walls. When the doors slid open, a long corridor stretched before her. Empty, silent. The patterned carpet muffled her footsteps as she walked towards the room. She hesitated one last time before unlocking the door. Inside, the room was pristine, almost unsettlingly so. The bed was perfectly made, the heavy curtains drawn, the air carrying a faint scent of roses. And something else. Something faintly rotten. She stepped inside. And then, the door slammed shut behind her. The lock clicked. She rushed back, grabbing the handle. It wouldn't budge. Then, from across the room, the bathroom mirror began to fog. A message appeared, letters forming slowly, as if traced by an unseen hand. You are not the first. The telephone beside the bed began to ring. Eleanor turned to look at the screen. Her own number was calling her. The phone continued to ring. Eleanor stood frozen, staring at the screen. Her own number was flashing back at her, as though mocking her every hesitation. Her breath quickened as she reached for the receiver, hands trembling with dread. The voice on the other end was barely a whisper, cold and heavy, like the wind on a winter night. He waits for you. The line went dead. Eleanor slowly lowered the receiver, her pulse pounding in her ears. The room felt smaller now, suffocating. She turned towards the mirror, her reflection staring back at her with wide, frightened eyes. But then, something changed. The fog on the mirror began to swirl again, moving as though it had a mind of its own. The letters appeared quickly this time, scratched out in jagged strokes. Don't let him in. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Her hands shook as she reached out for the bathroom door. The hallway outside was as silent as before, not a sound from the other rooms. Everything felt wrong, unnaturally still. She glanced back at the mirror and froze. The reflection wasn't hers anymore. It was someone else's. A woman with hollow eyes, pale skin, and a face twisted in agony. She was reaching out, her hand pressed against the glass. Eleanor gasped and stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The phone rang again, her own number. You are not alone. Before she could react, the door to the room creaked open, not from her hand, but from the inside. A cold gust of wind filled the room, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. The voices were louder now, a chorus of women, each one speaking at once, their words blurred by terror. He will come for you. You won't be the last. He loves to hear us scream. Eleanor staggered back, her eyes darting around the room, looking for any way out. The air felt thick, pressing in on her, suffocating. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the bed and a metallic scent filled her nose, sharp and unnatural. She pulled her hand away quickly. Blood. There was blood on the sheets. Old blood, crusted into the fabric, staining it dark red. Her breath hitched in her throat and a wave of nausea washed over her. She turned towards the door, but it slammed shut again, locking with a finality that sent a chill down her spine. The lights flickered. For a moment, everything was pitch black. Then, the whispering stopped. The silence was unbearable. Eleanor slowly turned, her body trembling as she reached for the light switch. But just before she could flick it on, the phone rang once more. This time, the voice on the other end was louder, almost pleading. "You have until 3 a.m. The door began to shake violently. Eleanor turned in time to see the lock twist. From the inside, the clock on the bedside table blinked. 02:59. The door burst open, and standing in the threshold was a figure, tall and cloaked in darkness. Eleanor stood paralyzed in the doorway, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure at the threshold remained motionless, as though it were nothing more than a shadow cast by the dim hallway light. But it wasn't the darkness that chilled her. It was the stillness, the utter lack of movement. It didn't breathe. Eleanor tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. Her body refused to respond as she instinctively stepped backward, her eyes never leaving the silhouette. The room was suffocating now, the walls closing in, the air thick with an oppressive weight. The figure did not move, but Eleanor's phone rang again. It was her own number once more. The voice on the other end was hollow, deeper, more menacing. "He is waiting. You're out of time." Before she could react, the lights flickered again, this time plunging the room into total darkness. Her breath came in sharp gasps, panic clawing at her chest. And then, the whispering started. Low at first, just a faint murmur like the wind, but it quickly grew louder, more urgent, until it became a cacophony of voices, screaming from every direction surrounding her in the suffocating blackness. "He is coming for you. He will claim you. Don't run." Her legs finally gave way, and she collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The whispering turned to laughter, sharp and deranged, echoing in her ears. The figure stepped forward, its presence looming closer, its shadow growing longer. She could feel its cold breath on her neck like fingers trailing down her spine. With trembling hands, Eleanor fumbled for the light switch, her vision swimming in and out of focus. The laughter crescendoed, louder and more horrifying with each passing second. Finally, her fingers found the switch. She flipped it. Light poured into the room, revealing the figure standing just inches away from her. But it wasn't just one figure. There were many. Dozens of pale faces, their eyes hollow and lifeless, were pressed up against the walls. Each face seemed to merge into the next, forming a grotesque mass of eyes and mouths that all screamed in unison. Their faces were contorted, in pain and terror, and then in the center of the room Eleanor saw him. The man, if he could be called that, stood still, his features obscured by the shadows. His eyes gleamed with malice, and the faintest trace of a smile twisted his lips. "It's time, Eleanor." A cold shiver ran through her, and the floor beneath her feet shifted. The entire room seemed to tilt, as though she was falling into a bottomless pit. The walls stretched and distorted, warping into shapes that were impossible, nightmarish. With a shriek, Eleanor tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't move. Her body was pinned, held by something unseen, like invisible chains wrapping tighter around her limbs. The clock on the bedside table flicked again. 3. At that exact moment, the shadows surged forward, swallowing her whole. The room went dark, again, and Eleanor screamed, only for the scream to be abruptly cut off. A cold hand, ice cold, clamped over her mouth, stifling her terror. Eleanor's scream was silenced, smothered by the cold hand that pressed over her mouth. She struggled, her body fighting against the invisible chains that held her in place, but the more she moved, the tighter they seemed to become. Her breath came in frantic bursts as she tried to twist her head, to break free. But the hand did not move. Instead, it dragged her, inch by inch, towards the center of the room. Her heart pounded in her chest, the rhythmic thud a loud drum in her ears. The darkness closed in, the air growing thicker, suffocating her, There was a foul stench, like rotten flowers, like decay, that filled her nostrils, choking her. The figure, the man with the hollow eyes, stepped forward. His smile had vanished, replaced by an unsettling, predatory gaze. His eyes burned with a cruel hunger. His lips curled slightly as he observed her struggle. "You've been chosen, Eleanor." His voice was a low murmur, but it reverberated in the room, bouncing off the walls like a twisted melody. Chosen? For what? Eleanor managed to gasp, her words barely escaping her lips. Her body felt weak, and the weight of the shadows pressing in on her was unbearable. The figure did not answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his breath cold against her skin. She tried to recoil, but the chains kept her in place, held by something far more sinister than mere ropes or metal. Then, the mirror, her reflection, changed. The fog on the glass swirled again, faster this time. The messages written in it shifted as if the very mirror itself was alive. They blurred together, the letters twisting and warping until they were no longer words but images. Visions of other women, faces she didn't recognize, their eyes wide and vacant, their mouths frozen in screams. Each one was dressed in the same dark gown that Eleanor now wore, their faces pale and gaunt. "They were once like you," the voice from behind her whispered, and Eleanor's heart stopped. She could feel the shadow drawing closer, its cold fingers grazing her neck. She turned desperately, her eyes wide with panic. "Who are they?" she demanded. "What do you want from me?" But the man simply smiled, his eyes gleaming with amusement. The figures around her, the women in the mirror, seemed to shift, their bodies moving as if they were trapped in a frozen nightmare. They were the last. His voice dropped to a whisper. "You will be the next." Suddenly, the phone rang again. The harsh sound sliced through the air, shattering the tension for just a moment. Eleanor, her body trembling, reached for the receiver. But as her hand closed around it, a deep, bone-chilling laugh echoed through the room. "It's too late, Eleanor." And then, everything stopped. The laughter, the voices, the cold hand on her mouth. The chain that held her broke, like a snapping thread. But instead of freedom, the world seemed to tilt, the walls bending unnaturally, the floor shifting beneath her feet. The room was changing. Eleanor stumbled backward, unable to maintain her balance. The very room she had once thought so familiar was now twisting, warping into something unrecognizable. The walls grew longer, stretched into grotesque shapes that looked like mouths and eyes, and the ceiling, what little she could see of it, was covered in grotesque, shifting patterns, as though something was crawling just out of sight. And then, just as suddenly, everything went still. The room was now perfectly still, as if nothing had changed, but Eleanor's heart was still racing. The air was thick with anticipation, like the calm before a storm. The clock blinked 03:15, and Eleanor heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind her. She turned. The figure was standing there again. But this time, it wasn't alone. Eleanor's body froze at the sight before her. The figure, the man with the hollow eyes, was now standing in the center of the room, his face obscured by the shifting shadows. But what took her breath away was not the figure itself, but the dozen faces that flanked him. Each face was pale, gaunt, and lifeless, like the women in the mirror, their eyes wide with terror. They stood, perfectly still, watching Eleanor with hollow, unblinking stares. Their hands were outstretched as though they too were trapped, reaching for something they could never have. "You see them, don't you?" The figure's voice was soft, almost affectionate. But there was no warmth in it, only a chilling emptiness that seemed to seep into her bones. "They are the ones before you." Eleanor stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. The clock on the bedside table blinked. 03:30. There was no more time. The figure moved toward her, his footsteps soundless, like a shadow stalking her every movement. Eleanor felt the air grow colder, and her breath turned to mist before her eyes. "They're just like you, Eleanor." His voice was closer now, his breath cold against her ear. "They thought they could leave just like you. But none of them did. None of them will." Eleanor's mind raced. She could feel her skin crawling as the cold air wrapped around her, clinging to her like a second skin. She had to escape. She had to get out. But her body felt frozen, unable to move, trapped in the invisible grip of something far more sinister than any force she had ever known. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that might help her. But there was nothing. The walls had closed in tighter, the space feeling smaller and more claustrophobic by the second. The doors were still locked, the windows sealed shut. The figure stepped forward again, and this time his face was no longer hidden by shadows. His face was unfamiliar, yet it felt so painfully familiar. His eyes, hollow and empty, as if they were carved out from the very essence of despair, gazed at her with a cold, unfeeling hunger. And his smile, it was a smile that made her blood run cold. A smile that spoke of things unspeakable. "This is your last step, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice slipping into her mind like ice. "You're about to join them, the others, the ones who thought they could run, but never did." The walls around her shifted again, as if the room itself was alive, breathing, pulsating with the dark energy that now filled it. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The panic was swallowing her whole. Then, just as she thought she would collapse, the phone rang once more. The sound pierced the suffocating silence, but this time it wasn't her number on the screen. The phone showed the figure's face, the man with the hollow eyes, his smile wide and knowing. And then, the voice on the other end spoke, clearer than before. "Your time is over." Suddenly the room began to spin, the walls and ceiling warping and contorting as if reality itself was unraveling. Eleanor reached for the walls to steady herself, but they dissolved into darkness, slipping through her fingers like smoke. She stumbled forward, her legs weak, her body trembling. She needed to get to the door. She had to get out before the floor beneath her cracked open with a deafening sound, and she fell into the abyss, into the unknown. Eleanor's body tumbled through the darkness, the world around her spinning out of control. Her screams were swallowed by the void, her mind overwhelmed by the suffocating silence that pressed in from all sides. Her hands flailed in the empty air, but she could find no purchase, no solid ground beneath her feet. The fall seemed endless, a free fall into a realm where time and space didn't exist. But then, a sudden stop. Eleanor's body slammed into something soft, her breath knocked out of her chest. She gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs, and when her vision finally cleared, she found herself in a new place. The air was heavy, suffused with a cold mist that clung to her skin like a wet sheet. The ground was slick, black as coal, and covered in a thin layer of fog. All around her stood the silent figures, the faces of the women from the mirror. They were here too, trapped in this place just like her, their eyes watching her with unblinking intensity. But the man, the figure with the hollow eyes, wasn't there. For a moment, Eleanor thought she might be safe. But safety was a lie. The room, or whatever this place was, began to shift again. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and the walls, if they could be called walls, began to close in, tightening around her like a cage. A low, rumbling growl filled the air, rising from the depths of the floor. It was the sound of something, ancient, something that had been waiting for this moment for her. Eleanor turned, her eyes wide with terror. In the center of the room stood the man. But now, his face was distorted, the hollow eyes stretched wide, as if they were too big for his skull. His body flickered like a dying flame, as if he was something not quite real, something that was slipping in and out of existence. "This is the end, Eleanor." His voice was deep, reverberating through the air like a death knell. "You are the last one, the last guest to enter my domain." Eleanor stepped back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was trapped. There was no way out. She could feel the walls pressing against her, the space shrinking with every passing second. "No," she screamed, her voice raw. "I can't be the last. I have to leave." But the figure simply smiled. "No one leaves. Suddenly, the ground beneath her shattered like glass. Eleanor fell once more, but this time, there was no darkness to consume her. Instead, she fell into a strange, empty space, an infinite void. The shadows that had once surrounded her now stretched and reached out, their cold hands grasping at her, pulling her deeper into the abyss. As she was pulled further and further, she saw them, the faces of the women who had come before her. Their eyes were wide with fear, their mouths open in silent screams, and their hands reached out, trying to pull her back. "Don't let him. Take you," one of them screamed silently, her eyes pleading. But the shadows were too powerful, and Eleanor's body was being dragged downward, deeper into the darkness. With every inch that she fell, she felt herself slipping away from reality, her very soul being ripped apart by the force of the void. She could no longer breathe. She could no longer think. All she knew was the cold, the suffocating cold that seemed to invade every part of her being. And then, just as she was about to disappear completely, she heard one last voice. A voice she knew. Her own. It's too late. The darkness swallowed her whole. And then, nothing. Silence. And so, Eleanor's fate was sealed in the chilling void, her scream lost in the endless darkness, her name whispered only by the shadows that devoured her. Was she the last? Or was there another waiting in the wings, destined to take her place? The hotel, with its cursed walls and haunting past, continues to call to those who dare to seek the answers. But remember, no one ever leaves. If you found yourself holding your breath, terrified with every twist and turn, make sure to leave a comment below. What do you think happened to Eleanor? Were there others before her, and will there be others after? Don't forget to share this story with your friends, if you dare, because the terror of the last guest isn't over. Who knows what lurks in the darkness waiting for its next victim? Don't forget to subscribe for more spine-chilling stories that will leave you haunted long after the last word. Some doors remain locked for a reason, but the worst ones are the ones that open by themselves. The golden key was heavier than expected, its surface worn down by time, its edges slightly rusted. Eleanor hesitated. The brass plate on the door read Room 404, its numbers slightly crooked as if someone had tried to pry them off. She had heard the rumors. Every employee who had worked in this room had vanished without a trace. The hotel management never spoke about them. The police never found a single clue. It was as if they had never existed. But tonight she had no choice. The hotel was old, its dim hallways stretching into a labyrinth of faded wallpaper and flickering bulbs. The storm outside howled like a wounded beast, rain lashing against the windows. Eleanor took a deep breath, slid the key into the lock and turned it. Click. The door creaked open on its own. The air inside smelled stale, damp, like something rotting just beneath the surface. A single lamp flickered on, casting long shadows on the floral wallpaper, its pattern peeling at the corners. And then, the phone rang. A sharp, piercing sound in the silence. Eleanor flinched. Her eyes darted to the nightstand, where an old-fashioned rotary phone sat, its black surface covered in a thin layer of dust. It shouldn't be ringing. Hesitantly, she picked up the receiver. Before she could say a word, a voice, her own voice, whispered on the other end. "Get out, now." Her breath hitched. The line went dead. Eleanor's hands trembled as she placed the receiver down. She turned toward the mirror on the wall and froze. The reflection staring back at her was not her own. It was her, yes, but not from this moment. The woman in the glass was older, thinner, eyes sunken with horror. Her lips trembled as if she was trying to scream, but no sound came out. And then, her reflection moved on its own. Eleanor hadn't moved an inch, but her reflection lifted a shaking hand and pointed toward the door. Her own voice echoed back at her, but this time from inside the mirror. "He sees you. Slam!" The door shut, violently behind her. The key was no longer in the lock. She was trapped. The light bulb flickered once, then died. The room was silent, but in the darkness, Eleanor heard breathing. There was someone else in the room. Eleanor couldn't see them, but she could hear them breathing. Her chest tightened. She pressed her back against the wall, her fingers digging into the peeling wallpaper. The breathing was slow, deliberate, right. Behind her, she swallowed the scream rising in her throat. "Move, Eleanor, now!" She lunged for the door, her hands fumbling over the smooth surface, searching for the handle, but it was gone. Impossible. She had just walked in, heart pounding. She spun around, her eyes frantically scanning the room. The dim glow from the nightstand lamp barely illuminated the space, casting flickering shadows on the walls. And that's when she saw it. A dark figure stood near the window. It wasn't facing her, but she knew. It knew she was there. The shape was distorted, like something struggling to take form, flickering like a candle's dying flame. Its head twitched violently, as if trying to turn toward her, but failing. Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps. She should have run. She should have screamed, but her body wouldn't move. Then, the phone rang again. "Bring! Bring!" The sound was deafening in the silence. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached for the receiver. Her instinct screamed, "Don't pick it up." But something inside her, something dark and twisted, needed to know who was calling. She lifted the receiver to her ear. Silence. And then, in a broken whisper, "You don't have much time." Eleanor's breath hitched. "Who are you?" She managed to croak. A pause, then her voice came again. "I was you." The line went dead. A cold gust of air brushed the back of her neck. The shadow had moved. Her stomach lurched. It was closer. Eleanor turned, and the room was empty. The reflection in the mirror was gone, but something was wrong. The lamp was still, flickering, and in the dim light she saw the wallpaper curling at the edges, revealing something underneath. Slowly, hesitantly, she stepped forward and peeled back a corner. Her fingers shook as she revealed words, hundreds of them, scratched into the plaster beneath the wallpaper. A single sentence repeated over and over in desperate, frantic handwriting. "Don't turn around." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Behind her, the breathing stopped. And then, a hand touched her shoulder. The room plunged into darkness. Eleanor screamed. The hand on her shoulder wasn't real, or at least it shouldn't have been. Eleanor's body went numb, as though time itself had frozen. The hand on her shoulder was ice cold, its fingers unnaturally long, pressing into her skin with a grip so tight she couldn't breathe. It wasn't human. She turned, heart hammering in her chest, expecting to see the shadow, the figure that had haunted her since the moment she stepped into the room. But there was nothing. The air grew frigid, biting at her skin like the sharpest of knives. The lamp flickered again, then went out entirely, leaving her blind in the suffocating blackness. Her pulse thudded in her ears. The silence was deafening. She was alone. But that hand, it didn't make sense. She had felt it. She knew it was there. Eleanor reached out blindly, her fingers brushing against the walls. She tried to steady her breath, but each exhale felt like a scream trapped in her throat. The walls were smooth, old, and the cold never left. Then, in the stillness, she heard it again. A soft scratching sound, a movement so faint it might have been imagined. Her hand, almost as if guided by something other than her own will, reached toward the source of the sound. Under the wallpaper, her fingers scraped against something rough, something that shouldn't have been there. She tore a corner of the wallpaper free. The words weren't just scratched in, they were etched, carved into the wall with the same frantic desperation as before, but this time they were different. "Run. It's too late, you're already in." Her breath caught in her throat. Suddenly, she felt something move beneath the wall. The scratching turned into a scraping, like claws dragging against the plaster. Eleanor stumbled back, her mind racing. What was happening? Her pulse quickened. As the sound grew louder, faster. It was coming from all directions. The walls were alive. Then, as if the room itself were breathing, the scratching stopped. And, in the silence that followed, she heard something else. A voice, but not her own. It whispered from somewhere deep within the walls, its tone twisted, distorted. "You should have listened." Eleanor spun around, her eyes searching the room for anything, anyone. But again, the room was empty, except for the reflection in the mirror. Her heart stopped. The figure staring back at her wasn't the same one she had seen before. It was her past self, standing behind her, eyes wide with terror, mouth agape as if screaming for help. But Eleanor couldn't hear her. She couldn't hear anything. The past Eleanor's mouth moved again, forming a word. A warning. Run. Suddenly, the mirror cracked. A shiver ran through her as the crack began to spread, slithering across the glass like a web of frost. The reflection twisted, contorted. Eleanor could see herself, but she wasn't herself anymore. It was as if she were looking at a future version. Her, face hollow, eyes sunken, her mouth twisted into a grin of madness. Eleanor stumbled back, terrified, and then, through the crack in the mirror, she saw the door, the one she had entered through, but it was no longer the same. It was blocked, sealed shut by something that should not have been there. The reflection smiled at her, the grin stretching wider with each passing second. And then, a voice from inside the mirror. "You can't leave. Not anymore." The clock struck midnight. But Eleanor was certain it had been midnight for hours. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the mirror, her reflection twisted into something unnatural. The grin that had spread across the glass was no longer just a smile. It was a mockery, a taunt. The air in the room was thick, suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in on her. The clock on the wall, once silent, now ticked with unholy precision, its hands moving backward, dragging time with it. Tick-tock, tick-tock. But it wasn't right. The room had felt like it was in perpetual darkness, and now the sound of the clock echoed like a countdown in her ears. Her eyes darted to the door, still sealed, still blocked. There was no way out. The reflection in the mirror began to change again, its eyes dull, its grin widening as it spoke. But this time it was not her own voice. "You've already made your choice, Eleanor." Her pulse quickened. The air around her seemed to freeze. That voice, it wasn't hers. It was another version of herself, a future version who had given up, who had surrendered to the room. Eleanor staggered back, shaking her head, her mind racing for an escape. Any escape. Suddenly, the reflection in the mirror began to move again. But this time it was her own body, her own movements. The mirror was no longer just showing her. It was showing her future. She saw herself standing by the door, staring at her own reflection with empty eyes, hands pressed against the glass. Her mouth moved as if speaking, but the words were muffled, distorted. "Please don't let me in." Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. Was this the future she was bound to? Was she doomed to become this hollow shell of herself? The room seemed to stretch, warping, bending out of shape. She wasn't sure how long she had been standing there, but the clock's incessant ticking seemed to stretch the minutes, hours, a never-ending cycle. She tried to move, but her legs were heavy, as if she were wading through water. It was then that she realized time wasn't moving forward anymore. Time had stopped. Her vision blurred as the room shifted, the walls twisting like a living thing. The corners of the room seemed to bend and stretch, repeating themselves like something caught in an infinite loop. The clock ticked. Tick, tock, tick, tock. She glanced down. The same number appeared over and over again. 404, as if mocking her, as if the room itself was reminding her that she was already lost. Desperate, she tried to step forward, but the room pulled her back, and suddenly, she was back in front of the mirror again. Her own reflection, frozen in time, stared at her with that same sinister grin, and then, the clock struck midnight once more. The room shifted again. She was no longer standing in front of the mirror. Instead, she was standing in front of a new door, one that hadn't been there before. And this door, it was different. It was inviting. Eleanor reached for the door, but as her fingers brushed the handle, she heard it. A whisper, low and mournful, from deep within the room. "Don't open it." The door was calling her, but Eleanor could feel the weight of every choice she had made pressing down on her like 1,000 hands. Eleanor stood before the door, her hand hovering just inches from the handle. The air around her felt thick, suffocating, like she was being pulled into the very heart of the room. She could feel it, the pressure, the weight of something ancient and unforgiving bearing down on her. The whisper, soft and tremulous, came again. "Don't open it." Eleanor's pulse throbbed in her temples. Her thoughts were a tangled mess, fear, curiosity, desperation, all blending into one chaotic storm. Was it a warning or a trap? The reflection in the mirror, her future self, seemed to stare at her with empty eyes, begging her silently to stay away from the door. But something deep inside her urged her forward. Her fingers brushed the handle. It was cold. Colder than she had ever imagined. Icy. As if it were not meant for human hands. Click. The door creaked open on its own. The sound was almost relieved, like a deep sigh escaping from the room. Eleanor stepped forward, her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't stop herself. She had to see what was beyond it. She had to know if there was any escape. The room beyond the door was dark, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. It stretched out infinitely, the walls disappearing into shadow. There were no windows, no light, only the sound of something whispering in the darkness. She hesitated, but as the door swung wide, she heard a voice that wasn't her own, but sounded so familiar. "You shouldn't have come." Eleanor spun around. The door had closed behind her and the room had shifted again. This was not the same room. It was darker, more claustrophobic. She was no longer in the same time. The walls began to move. Eleanor's chest tightened as the walls pressed inward, slowly, relentlessly. There was no escape. She could feel the air growing thin, suffocating her. The pressure against her chest was unbearable. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The clock's ticking had resumed, but now it sounded faster, louder, as though it were counting, down to something terrible. Suddenly she saw it, a figure standing in the corner. It was her, but not her. Her face was hollow, eyes sunken and void of life, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. Eleanor gasped. This was it. The future she had tried to avoid. The figure spoke, its voice dry and hollow as if it were an echo of something long dead. "You're trapped. We all are. The room won't let you leave." Her heart raced. The walls were closing in faster. Now. Her breath was shallow, desperate. She had to find a way out. But as she turned to flee, she noticed something. The door was gone. The walls had shifted again. She was trapped, completely trapped. The clock's ticking was deafening now, the sound of her own heartbeat almost drowned out by it. Then she heard something even worse, a sound from behind her, the breath of something far too close. Eleanor spun around, and that's when she saw it. The shadow, a figure looming. It was not human, not anymore. It was a thing that had been waiting for her, and then it spoke. "You made your choice, Eleanor. There's no going back now." As Eleanor's mind screamed for escape, the figure stepped closer, its unnatural grin widening, the walls pressed in tighter. There was no way out. There was no escape. Eleanor had already been consumed by the room, and now, she was the one watching. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest, as though her very soul was being ripped apart with each passing second. The shadow, The figure that had once been her loomed over her, its eyes gleaming with a knowing, malignant hunger. The walls were closing in, tightening around her as if they were made of some unearthly force, something alive. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the sound of the clock's relentless ticking seemed to echo through her very bones. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It was the countdown to her end. Her breaths were shallow, panic clouding her thoughts as she searched for some way to escape. But the figure, her reflection twisted and broken, was always there, watching her with cold, empty eyes. "It's too late, Eleanor." The voice was a low, guttural whisper vibrating through the walls. It was a sound that pierced the air, cutting into her very soul. Eleanor spun around, her hands trembling as she searched for an exit that didn't exist. There was no way out. No way to undo what had already been done. The figure took a step forward, its shape distorting and shifting, becoming more grotesque with each passing moment. It was not her, but it was her, and she realized with a sickening jolt that it was everything she would become if she stayed. And in that moment, she knew. She knew what the room had been trying to tell her all along. The room wasn't a place. It was a cycle, a loop repeating over and over, consuming anyone who dared to step inside. It wasn't just trapping her, it was shaping her, molding her into something new, something terrible. And now she was becoming it. The figure reached out, its cold, skeletal hand brushing against her cheek. She recoiled, but the touch was already inside her, deep within her mind, infecting her thoughts. "This is your fate now, Eleanor," it murmured. "This is your truth." The clock began to tick faster, each sound now a sharp stab in her brain. The room was suffocating, closing in from all sides, the walls pressing closer and closer as if they were devouring her. But then, the room shifted. Again. The door that had been lost, now stood before her, glowing faintly in the dark. Eleanor stumbled toward it, her hands reaching out as if in a dream. Could this be it? The way out? The end of the nightmare? The moment her fingers touched the doorknob, she felt it. The pulling sensation, the sickening twist that ran through her spine. The door. It was the only way out. But was it the end, or just another beginning? In an instant, she knew what had to be done. With trembling hands, she turned the doorknob, and as the door creaked open, the room seemed to collapse, the walls crumbling into nothingness, the shadows retreating. Eleanor stepped forward, her heart racing, her breath coming in quick, panicked bursts. She was free. She was out. But when she looked back, she saw it. The mirror. The reflection. And for a split second, she saw it clearly. It was her. But it wasn't. The girl standing there was frozen in time, her eyes empty, her mouth twisted into that same grotesque smile. Eleanor's reflection was calling to her, pleading, but this time Eleanor heard the words with clarity. "Run!" The door slammed shut behind her, and the room was swallowed whole by the void. The mirror was gone. The clock had stopped. She was free. But freedom came at a cost. Eleanor stumbled backward, gasping for breath, her body shaking. And then she heard it, the faintest echo of the clock's ticking. Tick-tock. Somewhere in the distance it began again. The end. Or is it? As Eleanor stepped away from the collapsing room, she thought she had escaped it all. She was free from the grasp of the loop. But was she? For in the distance she could still hear it, the ticking. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The clock had stopped, but only for a moment. Somewhere deep inside the darkened hallways of the twisted room, it was starting again. And the cycle would begin once more. Eleanor's freedom had come at a cost, but was it enough to break the curse? Or was the room just waiting for the next victim? Did Eleanor truly escape? Or was she now bound to the loop forever? What if someone else had walked into the room while she left? The questions echoed in her mind, unanswered, as the haunting memory of the room and the distorted reflection lingered, forever trapped in her thoughts. Thanks for watching. If you liked this story, leave your opinion in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more mystery stories that will keep you up at night. Stay tuned, because you never know when the cycle will start again.